Hello and welcome to Worlds Apart. It's been portrayed as both the world's best safeguard against corrupt bankers and potentially the biggest Ponzi scheme in the history of humanity. Why is Bitcoin so extreme, both in the fluctuations of its value and in the opinions it draws? Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by Patrick Merck, General Counsel of the Bitcoin Foundation. Mr. Merck, I really appreciate your time here.
Thanks for having me.
Now, we are recording this program just days after this landmark hearing in the Senate on the future of digital currencies. And one outcome of that hearing was that the value of Bitcoin soared past $900 and then dropped just as sharply. Do you see that as a positive development, that market reaction?
Well, I think it's a positive indicator of sentiment in the Bitcoin community. I don't know that I would consider it positive that there were the wild fluctuations in price.
But you know that this volatility of Bitcoin is what makes some people extremely excited about this new digital currency and other people extremely wary of Bitcoin. And I think it is also something that draws speculators in and may keep some of the mainstream consumers at bay. Have you thought of any sort of threshold value beyond which these steep increases will start impeding the growth of the market for the actual consumers rather than speculators?
Sure. Well, I don't think it has to be either or. There are speculators and mass consumer adoption of the U.S. dollar. Both play a role. Speculators help with price discovery, and of course, consumers use it as a currency. So I think that's likely to be the trend with Bitcoin as well. The difference is that it's supply and demand right now, and the demand is far outstripping supply, and that drives the price up in these parabolic curves. Mm-hmm. But eventually we'll settle in at a valuation that is fair for mass consumer adoption when we get to that point.
Absolutely, but I'm sure you heard Bitcoin skeptics comparing this new currency to a Ponzi scheme or warning of a possible bubble. And you know that, like in the case with housing bubble or high-tech bubble, the problem was not in the actual assets that were behind those industries, but in the amount of speculation that surrounded it. So it seems that the same thing is now happening with Bitcoin. A lot of speculators are drawn to it.
Well, maybe. I mean, who knows what's really happening. No one can even give you a good answer on why the price of a widely held and publicly traded stock like GE goes up and down on some days. So it's hard to predict why or how the Bitcoin price is moving or what's underlying it. Whether it's a bubble or not is suggestive that at some point it will eventually hit zero. I don't believe that to be true, so I wouldn't necessarily call it a bubble in that strict sense. Certainly there are going to be price surges and corrections. We'll probably see more of these along the way, again, as supply and demand work themselves out, as more and more consumers come into the system. Mm-hmm. It's probably going to be a few years while that happens. And that's one of the reasons why I caution people. This is a very high-risk environment, and it's really not ready yet for your average everyday investor to trust their savings mm-hmm. to it in any way. Anybody who puts money into the system now should expect that they could lose all of it.
Mm-hmm. Now, what do you think is the fair price of a Bitcoin unit at the moment? Would you yourself buy it for $900?
Sure. I mean, if this technology reaches even a fraction of its potential, then $900 would likely be a bargain, especially if it's used as a currency in the future. Now, it's also possible that Bitcoin could have an extremely useful purpose if it was valued at 10 cents, just as a payment mechanism. But most likely, it's going to be worth a lot more as more and more people use it, as more and more people see it as a legitimate alternative for payments online, for international remittances, and as a store of value.
But you do understand that the main condition the main incentive for people to see it as a viable alternative would be to decrease the volatility of that market, and that could only be done if not so many speculations were taking place. I wonder if you think there is any non-authoritarian way of reining in speculators and protecting those commercial consumers that see Bitcoin as a currency.
Sure. Well, I would just disagree with the premise slightly. I think what will happen is that right now there isn't the service layer built on top of the protocol yet, the infrastructure to support consumer adoption in a mass way yet. I think that the precedent thing to mass consumer adoptions, which will eventually settle out the price, is building a solid foundation infrastructure for the system. So that's Bitcoin exchanges that are functional in countries around the world, merchant acquirers like BitPay, who's testifying in the Senate as well, and of course, secure storage for Bitcoins for consumers who can't take the security risk on themselves, things like that. So that's the infrastructure that needs to be built out first. And I think as the infrastructure is built out, and then new service layers for consumer services, business-to-business services, things like that, that was what will level out the price.
Now, one of the issues that was raised at the hearing over and over again is a question of what is Bitcoin, whether it is a digital currency or a commodity. How do you yourself answer this question?
It's both, which is a little bit of a tricky answer, I suppose. What Bitcoin is it's a protocol for moving value across the internet, and it's a protocol for a whole new global financial system. And so currency is a part of that, commodities are a part of that, securities are a part of that. All of those things can be built on top of the Bitcoin protocol. So what I usually say to regulators when they say, well, what category does this fit in? Well, it depends on how you use Bitcoin. If you use Bitcoin to create securities, then you're regulated as a security. If you use it to make commodities, then you'll be regulated as a commodity. And if you use it to transmit money, then you'll be regulated as a money transmitter.
Now, part of the Bitcoin pitch is very aspirational, breaking free of manipulative governments and corrupt financial institutions. And I think the main thing that allowed many of their wrongdoings to happen was the lack of transparency. And yet, when it comes to Bitcoin, it's very difficult to come by any reliable data on what is an average value of transaction and what is the most common nature of transaction, whether it is driven by speculation, by some shady deals, or indeed by some, legitimate retail or commercial marketplace. And I wonder whether you have those estimates yourself, whether you know what is the distribution here.
Yeah, no, people work on that. I mean, I couldn't repeat to you now the actual numbers around that, or if I would even have them or access to them.
But, Mr. Merck, with all due respect, you work for an advocacy group, so, your main goal is to promote this currency, and yet some people say that speculation and, again, some shady deals account for a lion's share of the transactions. Do those statements have any credence to them?
I don't think so, no. And
but
so
how would you know if you don't know? I mean, you said that you don't know the distribution, but
Sure.
at the same time, you deny that speculation account for a significant share. How would you know?
Well, I didn't say speculation didn't account for a share of the price. I think there are a lot of speculators in the marketplace right now. But there's two levels of knowledge. So there's knowing that you have this public and transparent blockchain where all the information is available to people, and anybody can data mine that and look at that and see what's happening. But what you're talking about is information that would be collected by centralized points, exchanges, and things like that. Because if there were to be shady deals, it would happen at that level, not probably in the public blockchain. So that information is not as publicly available, but that also mirrors how the traditional financial system works as well. If there are shady deals happening in the NASDAQ, the NASDAQ would have that information, but it wouldn't be broadcast across the ticker tape.
But I guess before we cheer the spread of this digital currency around the world, we better know how it's being used at the moment. Isn't that a fair point?
Certainly, certainly. And transparent companies and honest brokers are releasing that information. So companies like BitPay, the merchant acquirer, and others as well, they release a lot of their data publicly because they want to build that trust in the community, and then more people want to use their service. And when people go to consumer websites and they see that icon there, if they see the Coinbase icon, soon the Circle icon, they'll know that those are trustworthy companies. If companies want to keep their books closed, they're entitled to do so, but they will not build trust in consumers. So I wouldn't necessarily want to go to a Bitcoin exchange that wasn't very transparent with that type of information. I'd also say that that's where regulations take effect. So those services are regulated industries. If you're running a Bitcoin exchange, that's highly regulated. So you have some transparency and accountability built in right there.
But I would assume that that transparency and accountability would be pretty limited at this point of time. You just mentioned that some of the shady deals that may be going on in actual financial markets, and we know from news reporting that many of the people who use Bitcoin so far have encountered hacking attacks, and Bitcoin thefts are pretty frequent. And I heard you saying that that is essentially, up to those people, that they shouldn't have trusted people that they trusted, or they should have been more disciplined or vigilant about their security. And I wonder if Bitcoin will ultimately set its users, its mass users, for the same kind of trap that bank clients fell for, and that is, a couple of smart but unscrupulous guys capitalizing on the illiteracy, in this case digital illiteracy, of the masses.
And that's actually a very good comparison. So one, I agree with you that that's a problem. And that's why, again, I don't think that we're quite ready for mass consumer adoption of Bitcoin, because these security issues need to be worked out. And they need to be worked out in two ways. On the one hand, we need to develop better software and services that put better tools for protecting Bitcoin wallets and distribute those to individuals who want to use them without having to trust a third party like a bank in the first place. On the other hand, we need to build out the infrastructure, the trusted infrastructure, so that people can feel like if they're not comfortable securing their own Bitcoins, there's a safe place to put it, and likely an insured place to put it. I think that's very important, and it's a very important point, and that will be a critical juncture before we get to mass consumer adoption.
So essentially what you're arguing for is the creation of some sort of digital Bitcoin banks. Is that right?
Yeah, that is. I think that's what you're going to see. If the banks themselves don't take the opportunity to deliver those services. So it would also not surprise me if you start seeing that the existing banks come into this picture and fill that gap, at least to some degree, by themselves.
And the question is, of course, whether the consumers can trust banks with doing that. But Mr. Merk, we have to take a short break now. When we come back, Bitcoin has been touted as a new currency capable of traversing borders and government regulation. But the question is, will governments allow it to happen? That's coming up in a few moments on Worlds Apart. Welcome back to Worlds Apart, where we are discussing Bitcoin's rise and spread with Patrick Merk, General Counsel of the Bitcoin Foundation. Mr. Merk, going back to that landmark Senate hearing, you got a pretty favorable reception from the lawmakers on Monday, and contrary to what some may have expected, Bitcoin wasn't accused of being the currency of choice for online gamblers and illicit drug traders. And I think many officials actually pointed out that crime had been the issue during the early days of credit cards and online payment systems. I wonder if you were surprised by how friendly and accommodating the lawmakers seemed to be.
I wasn't surprised at all, but I was very pleased. We've been working with these same lawmakers for months now. If there's one pattern that I've detected over time, dealing with law enforcement, regulators, policymakers, it's that the more those people understand the technology, the less afraid of it they become, and the more they embrace the potential for great societal good.
Well, in some circles it's called lobbying, but at the same time, the lawmakers didn't rule out the possibility of regulating digital currencies in the future. And I wonder how much regulation Bitcoin will be willing to accept, in particular from the U.S. government.
Well, again, I think you have to focus on the uses, right, and not the protocol. Generally, you don't see protocols like TCP/IP that runs the internet or SMTP that email is built off of being regulated directly. Rather, the service providers and how they use those protocols are regulated. Now, it may be that as we go through this wait-and-see process, which I think is the right approach for the government right now, that there are gaps that develop or specific rules or laws that need to be changed to accommodate a new distributed global economy. The best thing that we can do in that scenario is create an open dialogue between the Bitcoin community and federal regulators in the states and also globally to discuss the issues as they come up and work collaboratively to come up with the right solutions.
Well, this is a very politically correct answer. I will push you a little bit on that question. I was surprised to learn earlier that the U.S. Federal Election Commission said that Bitcoin could now be legally accepted as political donations. And the question I would like to ask you is whether you see any potential for using Bitcoin as a political instrument, for example, for expanding the U.S. influence around the world in a fashion similar to which the U.S. dollar is now being used? Well,
that would be pretty far off in the future, given just the market cap of Bitcoin today, to have any influence on monetary policy. If we get to that stage, and that is a fact, we think that it will not supplant a currency, but it will most likely discipline central banks to be thoughtful about how they manage their local currencies. In this case, it would be an apolitical currency and a global currency. So to the extent that the U.S. could use it, I don't know how they would use it any more than China or Russia or any of the other countries around the world. I don't know that the U.S. would have some inherent ability to either manipulate Bitcoin or manipulate other currencies through the use of Bitcoin.
Okay, let me shift gears here a little bit. When you talk about Bitcoin becoming this new international currency, do you think the U.S. authorities and the financial elite will just sit idly by and allow the Bitcoin crowd to chip away at the power and influence that they're used to having?
It wouldn't necessarily play out that way, as you described. You'd have competing influences, and I don't know that that's even a likely occurrence. I don't know that Bitcoin is going to replace any national currency.
Now, switching to other countries, some experts suggested that Bitcoin is gaining popularities in countries that have issues or problems with their national currencies. For example, some Argentinians are believed to use Bitcoin as an alternative to their national currency that is experiencing a lot of problems with high inflation. There's also been there've also been some reports about the Iranians using Bitcoin to circumvent currency sanctions. I wonder how far are you willing to go in defending this international status of Bitcoin that has been envisaged if the American government, for example, orders Bitcoin to suspend all operations in Iran? Do you think that would be possible? Would Bitcoin have to comply with that?
Well, there'd be nobody who could enforce that. Bitcoin is software, so nobody can tell software what to do except software, the code itself. And the code doesn't allow for that kind of control.
But Mr. Merck, I think over the past few months, we heard a lot of news about using various surveillance techniques by the NSA, and a lot of tech companies who I suppose also use all sorts of very secure protocols to spy on the rest of the world. So at least on a theoretical level, there should be a possibility there for some manipulative use.
Well, there's certainly a possibility for enforcement. If you were to break through sanctions in the U.S., it's the Office of Foreign Asset Control that manages that list. If you were providing a service that allowed people to circumvent OFAC sanctions, then there's certainly an enforcement case that could be made against you. You could be liable for those actions. But that's a different thing than saying preventing a Bitcoin transaction. The Bitcoin transaction on a peer-to-peer basis could happen from any 2 points in the world, and nobody could regulate that piece of it. Mm-hmm. But Argentina and Iran, those are two very different situations, and Cyprus as well. In the other situations you described, it's not so much sanctions, it's a matter of a flight to quality. And this gets back to keeping central banks honest with a apolitical currency like Bitcoin. What you'll see is if the central banks in a country devalue their own currency, the useful purpose of their own currency, you will see a flight to quality to a more useful currency like Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned that there is no central authority to Bitcoin, and when we talk about, and people in many countries are very critical of their financial authorities, of their governments, but in many of those countries, those institutions have at least some sense of responsibility. Maybe not always, but they do carry responsibility for their actions and for the value of their currency. In Bitcoin, as you said, there is no central authority. So is there ultimately any sense of responsibility there?
Well, it certainly is an experiment. And again, that's why I say that we're still in the very early stages of it, so we don't know how it will shape up. It may end up being that the most useful purpose for Bitcoin isn't as a traditional currency. It may be that it's more as a commodity or an asset class like gold, a safe store of value. Some people think of Bitcoin as gold 2.0. So it may be that the useful purpose for Bitcoin is a little bit different in 5 years than what we envision today. Mm-hmm. And of course, there are the non-financial uses of Bitcoin and the protocol as well. So it's very hard to predict the technology that will be built on top of this.
Now, one country that is particularly interested in Bitcoin nowadays is China, and the world's largest Bitcoin exchange, if I'm not mistaken, is located there. There's also an increasing acceptance of Bitcoin, both among online retailers and even among physical traders in China. And obviously China is so huge it can make or break any deal. How crucial do you think China is for Bitcoin expansion?
Well, I think it's a very fascinating market, and it's obviously there's a lot of growth potential there. What's also interesting is that it's a market where consumers have already understand virtual currency. They've been exposed to it. There is the QQ currency by Tencent that was issued there that had great success and was very quickly adopted. So it's a culture that's acclimated to digital currency already. So now that they have, and we have seen a dramatic uptick in interest and adoption in that country, and I think that's a great thing.
But it's also a country where the government controls a lot of internet activity. Is there any potential for danger here that the Chinese government will try to use or gain some sort of control over the use of Bitcoin to spread its influence?
Anything is possible, I suppose. Containing Bitcoin would be like containing the flow of information across the internet. And we do know that China has had success in doing that, but not in creating new or influencing the information that flows in and out of the country. More, they're able to block things. So I think the bigger risk is that if the government in China disapproves of Bitcoin transactions, they may attempt to block those, the transmission of those transactions. Mm-hmm. I think that's more likely than them somehow co-opting the system.
Mm-hmm. Now, and finally, a lot has been said throughout this program, and you know, at the Monday hearing about Bitcoin possibly becoming this new international monetary standard, more egalitarian, less dependent on the will of individual governments, something that would put power back into the hands of consumers. And sometimes it sounds too good to be true, especially for somebody here in Russia, because, you know, we are very, we have had our fair share of utopia here. So, you know, a couple of decades ago, people here even believed that sooner or later money will outlive its purpose, and, you know, services and goods will be exchanged fairly and, you know, voluntarily, but it never happened. If I could ask you to put yourself into the shoes of the sci-fi writer, what would you say are the biggest dangers of Bitcoin? Wow,
the biggest dangers. I think the biggest danger is that it never reaches its full potential. I think that would be the biggest danger, and by its full potential, I mean that the protocol stays pure as it is and user-defined, and through a distributed network with lots of individual participation. Now, I could see a future where there's centralization that happens of the network, of exchanges, of the payment processors and transaction processors known as miners in the system. I mean, those are possibilities. And I know at the Foundation we spend a lot of time thinking through those risks, their likelihood, and how we would address them. Our mission is to make sure that Bitcoin stays distributed and participatory and decentralized. So anything that would threaten one of those three things.
Mm-hmm. Regardless of the risks, you seem to believe that it's still worth trying. Mr. Merk, unfortunately, we have to leave it here. This is all we have time for. If you like the show, please join us again, same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.
So it's hard to predict why or how the Bitcoin price is moving or what's underlying it. Whether it's a bubble or not is suggestive that at some point it will eventually hit zero. I don't believe that to be true, so I wouldn't necessarily call it a bubble in that strict sense. Certainly there are going to be price surges and corrections. We'll probably see more of these along the way, again, as supply and demand work themselves out, as more and more consumers come into the system. Mm-hmm. It's probably going to be a few years while that happens. And that's one of the reasons why I caution people. This is a very high-risk environment, and it's really not ready yet for your average everyday investor to trust their savings mm-hmm. to it in any way.
Sharply. Do you see that as a positive development, that market reaction?
Well, I think it's a positive indicator of sentiment in the Bitcoin community. I don't know that I would consider it positive that there were the wild fluctuations in price.
But you know that this volatility of Bitcoin is what makes some people extremely excited about this new digital currency, and other people extremely wary of Bitcoin. And I think it is also something that draws speculators in and may keep some of the mainstream consumers at bay. Have you thought of any sort of threshold value beyond which these steep increases will... Absolutely, but I'm sure you heard Bitcoin skeptics comparing this new currency to a Ponzi scheme or warning of a possible bubble. And you know that, like in the case with housing bubble or high-tech bubble, the problem was not in the actual assets that were behind those industries, but in the amount of speculation that surrounded it. So it seems that the same thing is now happening with Bitcoin. A lot of speculators are drawn to it.
Well, maybe. I mean, who knows what's really happening. No one can even give you a good answer on why the price of a widely held and publicly traded stock like GE goes up and down on some days, or...
Hello and welcome to Worlds Apart. It's been portrayed as both the world's best safeguard against corrupt bankers and potentially the biggest Ponzi scheme in the history of humanity. Why is Bitcoin so extreme, both in the fluctuations of its value and in the opinions it draws? Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by Patrick Merk, General Counsel of the Bitcoin Foundation. Mr. Merk, I really appreciate your time here.
Thanks for having me.
Now, we are recording this program just days after this landmark hearing in the Senate on the future of digital currencies. And one outcome of that hearing was that the value of Bitcoin soared past $900 and then dropped just to start impeding the growth of the market for the actual consumers rather than speculators.
Sure. Well, I don't think it has to be either or. There are speculators and mass consumer adoption of the U.S. dollar. Both play a role. Speculators help with price discovery, and of course, consumers use it as a currency. So I think that's likely to be the trend with Bitcoin as well. The difference is that it's supply and demand right now, and the demand is far outstripping supply, and that drives the price up in these parabolic curves, but eventually we'll settle in at a valuation that is fair for mass consumer adoption when we get to that point.
Absolutely.